Okay, we're going to begin with prayer from the Matins for the Feast of St. Nicholas. And the Feast of St. Nicholas falls on December 6th, so this coming Sunday. And it is a feast that is celebrated by many people, many churches and communities. And, and I think it's important to kind of to tap into some of that heritage and understand why, because I think Nicholas is sometimes a little misunderstood, and that's more our problem as we tell his story and not quite get what the church is teaching us through this man. So let's begin with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Sound the trumpet, dance on the feast, be glad in the joyful memorial of our God-bearing Father. Let emperors and princes assemble with the King, who through a dream was persuaded to release 3 unjustly accused prisoners. Assemble, O shepherds and teachers of the Good Shepherd. Praise the pastor who was your equal in zeal, extolling the great bishop, the physician of the sick, the deliverer of the imperiled, the companion of travelers, the advocate of sinners, the treasure of the poor, the comforter of the afflicted, the pilot of seafarers, the great bishop who is always fervently present to those in need. Let us say, O holy Nicholas, deliver us from present needs and save your flock by your prayers. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, I guess in order to kind of peel back a little bit of the historical peel back to the historical Saint Nicholas, it's probably a good idea to first comment on some of the American lore regarding Santa Claus. And so if you have any kids around there, so you might not want to have exposed them to this. Santa Claus is a big part of American Christmas. And we can recognize in him in certain virtues of generosity, especially. We can recognize in him the Bishop Nicholas of Myra. And then there's a lot that we can't really recognize the bishop in, from Mrs. Claus to reindeer and flying sleighs and all that stuff. And so where does the Santa Claus stuff come from? When this country was first founded, so one of the issues that our founding fathers felt very strongly about was the creation of a certain national narrative. And because we were a country and a people without a proper history, and the English traditions and culture were very strong among the first Americans, and that made it not always all that great, considering that England was not particularly happy letting the colonies go. And then they tried to take them over again at the beginning of the 19th century. So the Englishness of Christmas and the Christmas traditions was a little difficult to stomach as an American narrative. And so enter in a very gifted author named Washington Irving, someone who you should be familiar with from the legend of Sleepy Hollow. he's very often more connected or seemingly connected to Halloween than to Christmas. And yet he definitely has a hand in crafting the American narrative that is what we are familiar with, the Christmas of the US, that has now conversely affected other countries. So therefore colonialism. He wrote this book in 1809, which was a response to a book written by Dr. Samuel Mitchell. Samuel Mitchell was a noted storyteller. He loved to exaggerate, and he had a knack for it. And he wrote a book about the history of New York. And in that book, he had, well, a lot of things that had no proof. And so Washington Irving composed a response to that book. It was done as a parody. And he wrote it under the pen name of Dietrich Knickerbocker. So it was made to sound very Dutch, at least to English-speaking ears. And he wrote this book in 1809. It was published in 1809, called, and this is, you can tell that this was supposed to be a humorous book just from the title. It is called A History of New York from the Beginning of the World to the End of the Dutch Dynasty. And in this book, he wrote about different traditions. And one of the traditions was about the founding of Manhattan. And he said when Dutch sailors came to the island of Manhattan, one of the sailors had a vision of St. Nicholas. And St. Nicholas told him to establish the city there. And so in a way, New York City is established by St. Nicholas, which is kind of fun and funny on many levels. And then from there, it just develops the whole narrative about Santa Claus. And Santa Claus is, without, I don't want to get too much into this part of it. You can Google it, you can read the book, you know, for your own leisure. You can find plenty of information about the origins of Santa Claus. But, you know, Santa Claus is a version of Sinterklaas, which is in Dutch is Saint Nicholas. And then some other elements that have come into the story. Washington Irving spent a good 17 years in England from 1815 on. And so when he was there, he really developed, I would say, a storyline that greatly enriched even his previous telling. And he wrote about the Christmas traditions that we're familiar with. And he saw Christmas as a spiritual necessity, as something, I mean, he called it literally a spiritual necessity, because it was that one time of year when a certain feeling of generosity would dominate all the peoples who live in the land, and they would share in this uniquely American celebration. Of course, after 17 years in England, his fondness for English Christmas shows a lot in his writing too. So it is very English, but he did pick up on other traditions too. So for example, where we get Kris Kringle, you know, how do we have that as the name of Santa Claus? Well, Martin Luther during the Reformation, so he had an issue with the saints, and he had an issue with the popularity of Saint Nicholas. And Saint Nicholas would come riding on a horse to German villages, and he would distribute gifts to the children. At Christmas time, gifts were not being distributed. So it was originally tied to the feast of Saint Nicholas, and the gifts were primarily given to children. And since Martin Luther had an issue with the veneration of saints, and Saint Nicholas was numero uno, he was the most popular saint in Europe, so he replaced Saint Nicholas with the Christ child. And so you would see, and you can actually see, if you Google it, you can actually see like Christmas cards from Germany 100 years ago that show the Christ child sitting on a horse, taking gifts around. So he got rid of the veneration of Saint Nicholas, but put in the child, moved the celebration of gifts to Christmas, the Nativity, and in German, Christ child is Christkindl, which sounds like Kris Kringle. Get it? So Washington Irving adapted some of the European traditions and managed to, in a sense, bring back Santa Claus, or Saint Nicholas, in the version of Santa Claus, but associated him with Christmas. And so we get then from this, let me show you the images that would have been mid 1800s, where we begin to see this forming of a image of Saint Nicholas, of Santa Claus, and then he gets even more interesting. And here we see, kind of familiar with a certain English twist, including smoking a pipe. And then another one of the images, these are from Thomas Nast. And Thomas Nast created some of the first imagery of the American Santa Claus. And so, and here you see him, coming down the chimney, and the chimney is connected to Saint Nicholas. So they did borrow little pieces, parts from the life of Saint Nicholas. And then we get here to Santa Claus reading the letters written to him. And then bump ahead to 1931, when Santa Claus goes through a major overhaul, and we get this. And so this is the more familiar one, and we can thank Coca-Cola for bringing us the Santa that we are familiar with. Sadly, very little of that Saint Nicholas is present there. And so I think it's very important to go back a little bit and rediscover this man. So Saint Nicholas was born around the year 270 in the city of Patara. And Patara is close to the coast on the Mediterranean from the province of Lycia. And so that would be today in like southern Turkey, but on the Mediterranean coast. And so he was born in the year 270 to a well-to-do family. The family, we're not sure where their economic strength was based, but since it is a coastal town, there are traditions that associate the family with shipping, being merchants, and fishing, and even perhaps some transport and travel of goods and people. And so, and a part of that question about his background comes really from the fact that he is associated as a saint with the sea. And so they're trying to prove some connection that would be already in his DNA, in his family background. When he was young, both of his parents died, leaving him an orphan. Now, he was raised, though, within a very devout family. Both parents were Christian. And remember that the late 3rd century is still a period of persecution of Christians. And the persecutions were quite bitter. And so for them to be Christians was still at a great risk, not only to their lives, but also to their livelihood, to their economic success, because with one fell swoop, the politics of the local province or the town can turn, and they as Christians can be tried, their properties can be taken away, and they could even be subject to persecution and death. And so being pious Christians was something that was important, and that's why it is recorded in the story of his life. And just so that I think we might as well insert that into this part, his life story was recorded by the local church and specifically kept in monasteries. Monasteries had libraries, and all of these would be written by hand. And the lives of saints were then accessible to the monks and the nuns, and would be used then to teach Christian virtue. And so the life of Saint Nicholas was preserved in and around his see, where he was served as priest and bishop in Myra. And then finally, it came out in a comprehensive volume that was authored by Michael the Archimandrite. And he lived in the first half of the 9th century. And so he went and got all these different monastic sources and brought them together, put together the different miracles, because the different lives of Saint Nicholas had different details and miracles. The one problem is that he also used a source that was from a local monastery, but it wasn't the Saint Nicholas. And he's a lesser known saint, but now experts who have been looking through the text recognize that he used that source, because we do know the other source. And that's the life of Nicholas of Zion, and that's not Nicholas of Myra. But nonetheless, the details of his life that we do know, and the ones that I'm sharing with you this evening, they all come from the biography written by Michael the Archimandrite. And so we know that Nicholas came from this pious family, and it was very important for that to be known, because it was still a time of persecution. from his earliest childhood, he was known to undertake the rigors of fasting and prayer. Even, and this is a very interesting tradition too, that it shows up in his life story, even as an infant, he was known to fast from mother's milk. And this is a fresco from the 11th century in northern Italy, which shows Nicholas as a child turning away his head from feeding as an infant. And so that was one of the stories that very early on showed the piety and devotion of the child. When his parents died, so Nicholas was entrusted to an uncle, and his uncle was a priest, possibly a bishop. And so this uncle had a great influence on the upbringing of his nephew. And when Nicholas became old enough, he began a process of giving away all of the wealth that he had inherited. And so from that period, that is when we hear some of the miraculous stories about Nicholas going and, for example, rescuing the 3 daughters of a poor man. And this is again a contextualized story that's difficult for us to understand. At that time, a young woman, in order to marry well, needed to bring to the marriage a dowry. So she had her own means. And this dowry could consist of money, but it could be property, it could be a business, it could be stuff, jewelry, whatever, but she would need that as like her part of what she is bringing into the marriage. And this poor man, as the story goes, did not have enough money for the 3 daughters, and so he was going to let them go into prostitution. And this was going to be a way, because, the other thing, he could not take care of them. He knew that they would, at some point, need to have some money in order to pay for a house and their expenses. And so going into prostitution would provide them some means so that they could support themselves. And so Nicholas, as a young man, so this story is told actually before he became a priest in some of the versions. He went and he secretly left a purse of coins in the home for the first daughter. And then he returned again for the second daughter when she became of marriage age, so that she would have a dowry. And then again, a third time, he did that for the third daughter. And it was at that time that the father actually discovered that it was Nicholas who was doing this, and Nicholas instructed him to tell no one. And that, and he told him that indeed this father's salvation depended on his ability to keep that secret. And so, and that's, I think, the way that it's worded, it has to do more with honor, the honor of the father. And so salvation is kind of a more ample term, but it is more about the honor, since the father couldn't provide for his daughters. And so we hear that's one of the great miracles that is very often brought up. the chimney thing is connected to it, because there are stories then that go and say, well, he dropped it into a window, and but then when he came back, the window was closed because it was a cold night. And since the fireplace usually burns out during the night, so he dropped it down the chimney in the wee hours of the morning. And as it fell down the chimney, hitting the ground, the bricks of the fireplace, the money scattered and fell into the shoes and the socks that were by the fireplace overnight drying. See, some of this is familiar. It's part of the Santa Claus lore. And so I do give credit to Washington Irving. He really did weave a very nice tale. But St. Nicholas's miracles they continue to multiply. So he goes, for example, on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, the ship comes into a storm. And on 2 occasions, he prays to God and leads the other shipmates in praying, and the sea becomes calm. And so there begins his connection to the sea and to travel. And so soon after, after his return from the Holy Land, we're told that he was at some point ordained a priest, ordained a young priest, and probably also imprisoned. Because at this, in this time period, so we're looking at the end of the 3rd century, and we come to the reign of Diocletian. And Diocletian is the last of the really crazy Roman emperors. And the Romans had this tradition of sacrificing animals to the Roman gods. And around the year 298-99, Diocletian goes and has an animal slaughtered according to the Roman tradition, and then calls a pagan priest to cut the animal open, and then they pull out the entrails, and then the priest interprets what he sees as being like the fortune of the empire, what is going to happen. It's like, that's kind of serious fortune telling. I mean, gosh, why couldn't they just read a cup of coffee? But he did it big, and the priest told him that he could not get a clear message from the gods, because the gods are greatly displeased that in the very court of the capital of Rome, there are many people who make crosses on their bodies. So even in the Roman court, there were Christians present. And Christians didn't make the sign of the cross like we do today, big. They made little crosses. What is done very often, like in the Roman church, for the reading of the gospel. And so that was the way that the crosses were made. But this priest, I think he used the situation to create what would become a great persecution, and really the last great persecution of Christians before the arrival of Christianity under Constantine. And so Diocletian begins by cleansing his court of all the Christians. And he creates such a reaction to Christianity within the empire that even in Turkey, in Myra, which is technically very far and remote from Rome itself, although it's a port town, Myra is not that big. And so even there, they are rounding up Christians. And Nicholas is arrested probably as a priest, possibly as a bishop, because we don't know exactly when he becomes a bishop. And so Nicholas spends a significant period of time in prison where he is beaten and where he suffers. And when he comes out of prison, when he is released finally, so he is treated as a martyr, as a living martyr. And because he was the priest, so of course his suffering was probably greater than other people who had been rounded up, because they knew his value and his importance in the church. And so that created for Nicholas, it created a reality where he was well known and very well respected. Now, the election as bishop comes about also under miraculous circumstances. So either, and as I said, we're not sure about the placement of time as far as imprisonment, if that was as bishop or priest, but his election comes about when the bishops of the See of Antioch are having a election to replace the bishop of Myra, who had passed away. And they themselves were not having a great success figuring out who to send there. And so an angel appears to the bishops and instructs them to choose Nicholas. And so Nicholas of Patara becomes Nicholas of Myra. And so he is elected unanimously as bishop, and he is put there into place in this city, which is not a significant city, but a city that nonetheless has a thriving presence of Christians, and he begins to serve as a bishop. Now, interestingly enough, we don't really have, other than from his life different miracles, we don't have any homilies preserved of his. We don't have any of his writings. You know, he did not write like John Chrysostom or Athanasius of Alexandria. Many other fathers were known for preaching, and their homilies were written by scribes, and we can still today read their homilies. From Nicholas, we don't have anything from that period. And so then the question is, well, what does that say about him? Well, maybe he was just a okay preacher. What we do know is that he comes out in the forefront as one of the fathers who deals with Arius and Arianism. So in the early church, I would say the first big problem was the heresy of Arius. And Arius was a priest of Libyan background, so probably North African, maybe Egyptian, Roman background. He was he was born in the year 256, and he developed his own Christology, his own understanding of God the Father, God the Son. And his focus was primarily on God the Father. Arius was not by any means unusual. Remember that the church had been working underground, persecuted for a couple of centuries. And Arius, like other priests and bishops, taught the faith as they understood it. And those who were more theologically inclined, so they wrote about it. And so that's where we get, from the early church, we get like Origen. And Origen influenced Arius greatly, although Arius did go out on his own. And so his teachings are, in a nutshell, the Father's divinity is greater than the Son's. Then the Father is unique, and the Son is subordinate under the Father. Father and Son are not equal. And then finally, there was a time when the Son did not exist, but only the Father is eternal. And so this heresy, Arianism, it spread. And he himself was a very effective speaker. And his writings, this is how this was passed around. His writings were copied by his followers, who then copied that, and they continued to spread it around. So Arianism was found all around the Roman Empire. And so much so that there were established bishops who were leading churches, and they were teaching this theology. It created a lot of friction within the church, as you can imagine, because even before the legalization of Christianity in the year 313 by Constantine, the church was divided theologically. And once the church was legal in the Roman Empire, then this theological sparring would become really theological warfare. And of course, the understanding of Arianism, the understanding about Christ, the teaching about Christ, greatly distorts what the church actually teaches. And so it became necessary, in order to resolve this, it became necessary to create an event where the bishops could come together and debate about the teaching of the church regarding Father and Son and their relationship. And so Constantine called all the bishops of the entire Roman world, from the entire Roman Empire. He called all the bishops together in the city of Nicaea outside of Constantinople. Constantinople was founded in the year 324. Nicaea was called in the year 325. Why Nicaea, not Constantinople? Because after all, that would be kind of cool. The first thing this new city does is host a council. Probably because Constantinople was not yet complete. It was still being built. Nicaea was a city that already existed. And so Constantine calls all the bishops, and the bishops come together. We're probably over between 200 and 300 bishops attend. Every see of the church is represented, with the exception of the British Isles. So all of the churches, the Pope, who was aged at this time, the Pope sent representatives. And that is the bishops who could not attend, and then especially in the West, many bishops did not travel to attend that council. They would have sent representatives. The East was well represented because, of course, geographic proximity. And one of the bishops who went to Nicaea was none other than Nicholas, who was already at that time well established in his diocese. And Nicholas, we're told, had an interesting experience of Arius. Arius, not only is he convincing, so Arius is not like, he is not a TV preacher. He is not Joel Osteen. This is a man who is living the life. He is a monastic. He is very austere. He knew how to speak. He believed deeply in what he taught, even though it was not correct. And many of the bishops who heard him speak and did not support him actually came to his defense and came to understand his position. He defended his position well, using scriptures. So, but again, we don't know how the exact words he used, because after the council, there was an edict to destroy all of Arius's works. And so the only place where we know about him are the writings of his opponents, and specifically like Athanasius of Alexandria. He is one of those who wrote against him. Athanasius was a deacon who served as a representative of the Patriarchate of Alexandria. However, he was not a member of the bishops who were voting on these things. He served as a scribe, and he recorded and wrote the decisions of the council. And so, however, Athanasius was formed within that the correct mindset that would go against Arius. And so we hear from the story of Nicholas, and this is one of those details that is disputed for various reasons. We hear that Nicholas, sitting in council, listening to Arius expound his heresy, and seeing the bishops around him nodding and becoming convinced of what Arius was teaching, Nicholas becomes so enraged that he goes up to Arius and he punches him in the face. And so now the other story will say he slapped him. And so there are a couple of different versions of this. The reason why this makes some people uncomfortable is because there are laws in canon law about physical violence, that a priest can't actually do that. And by hitting another priest, it makes it even worse. And so the canonical ramifications, and come on, give me a break. Canon law, we're going to throw this at poor Nick. But what we see this side of him that is very passionate for the truth. And so he picks up his hand to silence the one who was spewing inaccuracies. in many circles, you're going to find historians will kind of debate this, and they're going to say this is not true, this never happened. But one of the best pieces of evidence that we have in the iconographic tradition of St. Nicholas, and with the oldest icons dating from the 8th century, icons that were probably also influenced by the biography written by Michael the Archimandrite. So we see in the icons the figure of Mary to the side of Nicholas's head, a little tiny figure, and she is holding in her hands, she is holding the bishop's pallium, the omophorion, we say in Greek. The pallium, which was a symbol of the authority of the bishop. And so, why is she holding it? Well, the story goes that Constantine, when he called together the bishops, Constantine also instructed the bishops that there were certain rules they needed to follow in order to be at council. And one of those was not to become aggressive. And so they could argue, but they could not physically, hit someone. And so because of these rules, when Nicholas did this, he was taken out of council and thrown into a cell, into a prison, and his pallium, the sign of his authority as a bishop, was removed from him. And so that night, he spent the night in the prison. That night, Mary appeared to Constantine, and she presented Constantine the pallium of Nicholas, and she told him to give it back to Nicholas. And Mary also appeared to a number of the bishops with that same message, that same image. And so that's how Nicholas then was restored to the gathering. We see that, I do want to share that we see that right here. There is Mary holding the pallium. And here's another one that has that. There is Mary holding the pallium right next to Nicholas. And then there's Jesus on the other side. And so Nicholas becomes then kind of this hero to the council, and the council begins to change. And as the theology is worked out, the bishops agree upon a statement of faith, and the statement of faith is the foundation of the creed. We say the Nicene Creed. Its final form came from the Council of Constantinople 50 years later. But most of the creed as we know it was penned at the Council of Nicaea in 325. And the primary doctrine is the word homoousion. Homoousion means of one essence. It is sometimes translated into English as consubstantial. They're all big words that are very difficult to translate. And so basically the statement of faith as established by the church at Nicaea reads, the Father and the Son are of one essence. They are consubstantial and co-eternal. The other statement that comes out is the following, and this comes from Constantine himself as part of the final documents of the Council of Nicaea. If any writings composed by Arius should be found, they should be handed over to the flames, so that not only will the wickedness of his teaching be obliterated, but nothing will be left even to remind anyone of him. And I hereby make a public order that if someone should be discovered to have hidden writings composed by Arius, and not to have immediately brought it forward and destroyed it by fire, his penalty shall be death. As soon as he is discovered in this offense, he shall be submitted for capital punishment. Very Christian. Well, in defense of Constantine, at this time he actually was not yet baptized. So he was just doing what Romans do. The strong wording, though, I think is more of a reflection of the reality that Constantine realized that the church would become split. That if there wasn't a common agreement on the theology of that the church would believe and teach, then this would eventually grow into two different communities. And so, and I think he was right, because all we need to do is look back to the Reformation and see what can happen when divergent theologies come forward. Arius was not really defrocked. He had friends in high places, so he ended up going to Antioch. He spent time in the Holy Land. There were other priests and monks and even bishops who supported him. And he eventually he felt that he had been wronged, and that those who had chosen the opposing theology, that they were actually the heretics. And so he continued to teach, he continued to preach, and of course had the protection of those who believed his view. Arianism continues to exist in the church until the 8th century. So it's still like, we're talking about the 4th century at this point. So another 400 years before Arianism and its other lesser views. There are semi-Arians, those also, but still heretical. It took a long time for that to be completely eradicated, even though I guess today there are some who do espouse Arian views and call themselves Christians too. So it is kind of the heresy that didn't completely disappear. Arius dies in, of all places, the city of Constantinople. So he had friends in high places. There were people who protected him, but there are also people who really hated him. And so, I would like to share with you what is a horrifying story of the death of Arius. So this was written by a man named Socrates Scholasticos, and he wrote it as an eyewitness, and he was a staunch defender of orthodoxy, the true faith, and Nicaea, and so he really does not like Arius. And so he wrote here, "It was Saturday, and Arius was expecting to assemble with the church on the day following. But divine retribution overtook his daring criminalities. going out of the imperial palace. So he was being hosted by Constantine. See, this is the other dirty little secret. Constantine did like Arius. Going out of the imperial palace, attended by a crowd of Eusebian partisans. Eusebius was a supporter of Arius also. He paraded through the midst of the city, attracting the notice of all the people. As he approached the place called Constantine's Forum, where a column of marble is erected, a terror arising from the remorse of conscience seized Arius. Yeah, I don't know about that. And with the terror, a violent relaxation of the bowels. Sounds kind of like he might have been poisoned. He therefore inquired whether there was a convenient place nearby, and being directed to the back of Constantine's Forum, he hastened there. Soon after, a faintness came over him, and together with the evacuations of his bowels, and his bowels protruded, so not good news, followed by copious blood loss and the descent of smaller intestines and portions of his spleen and liver in the effusion of blood, he almost died immediately. So that is the description of the end of Arius. It is, and yeah, I don't think how that could be. I guess you know what they say to the victor goes also the rewriting of history. So I think he got to put in his 2 cents. And he says at the very end, he said, there is a perpetual remembrance preserved in this extraordinary kind of death. So that's what happens to heretics. Apparently getting punched in the face by Nicholas is not enough. Socrates, though, does reveal, I think, a part of this is also playing on the Romans. These people are culturally Roman. And so they're a little superstitious, even with the faith, even with religion. And so to have a story told about the death of Arius and the death being so grotesque, and it not being an execution, it not being an assassination, it sends a message, or that's what it was aimed at least sending a message to the followers of Arius's theology, and also to scare the people. So if anybody was very positive for Arius, that would not be a good thing. But Nicholas, after the council, I do want to share, this is one of my favorite parts of the internet, is, let's see. Take a little time to read it. These are wonderful Christmas memes that would be also very good as Christmas cards. And there's also this one. And I love that they're using icons too, very appropriate. And then finally, if you'll indulge me, and I think that's my favorite one. So at least he's made it into the memes and they're not showing Santa Claus. I think that's a win-win for St. Nick. St. Nicholas, though, does go back to his life in the Diocese of Myra, which is an archdiocese. And the miracles continue. He continues to, his city is one of the strongholds of Nicene Christianity. So Arianism is not present there at all. We don't know what he did, but no doubt he taught the faith and insisted that his priest also did the same, so that the Arians would not find a place where they could cause confusion. At a time when in the church, you could make the claim that of Christian priests and bishops serving in the church in this period between Nicaea and the Council of Constantinople, you could even say that in some regions, it was 50-50, 50% Nicene and 50% Arian. So the Nicene heresy, or the Arian heresy, was very widespread. How do we know that Nicholas was able to keep the Arians away? Well, the son of Constantine, when he took over the empire, so he began a purging and cleaning. He was Arian, very strongly Arian. And so he began by putting in bishops, especially in the sees where they were bishops who were particularly loud about their theology against the Arians. He began to replace them. He did absolutely nothing to Nicholas. And Nicholas, that means Nicholas was very loved in his diocese. He knew that if he would have tried to come in and replace him, there would have been upheaval and even violence. And so he remains in power. What are the many stories about Nicholas and Nicholas's miracles? Well, one of the stories goes that when Nicholas, as bishop, was leading the city, the entire region and the city of Myra was going through a famine. Nicholas appeared to, as bishop, appeared to a ship captain who was off the coast, and he was carrying corn and grains of some sort. And and he appeared to him and convinced him in this apparition to come to the city of Myra and to bring all of the supplies he had so that his people would live. Also, when three men who were officers in the army of Constantine, three men were accused of sedition and treason, and yet they were innocent. It was because of a political intrigue. So these three men had prayed to God for deliverance, and Nicholas appeared to Constantine. This is all still within Nicholas's lifetime. So this is not him appearing after death. And he appears to Constantine, and he tells Constantine that they are innocent, and that and he shows Constantine the treachery of another who was involved in this. And so the three men then are saved from execution, and all three become monks. Then there is the story of three children who were kidnapped and and the kidnapping went wrong, and so the children were murdered and then put into pickling barrels as a way of hiding the bodies. And Nicholas actually comes to where the 3 barrels are with the 3 children, and he pulls them out of the barrels and restores them to life. So these are like the main stories that we see. And interesting, little details. They're all 3s. 3 daughters, 3 children, 3 men. So it's almost like a little Trinitarian statement in each of these miraculous events. And Nicholas, though, is also unusual in all of the miracles performed that happen at sea, of those who cried out to him and he appeared to them, rescuing them. One of I think the most interesting parts of the life of Nicholas is that, so we know when he died. He died on December 6th in the year 343. He outlived Constantine. He is basically contemporary to Constantine. Their lives line up. And he died in his own bed of old age. And when it comes to saints, there's a lot of like martyrs, there are a lot of bishops getting eaten by lions, and apostles crucified and beheaded, and so this is kind of nice, to see that he died. And I think that was a part of some of the church was in a period of transition where no longer were there martyrdoms on a large scale. And so this person of a bishop who was beloved, who was generous, who was the embodiment of different Christian virtues, whose faith brought people back to life, whose concern for his people, he knew them, he knew the story, in a town where he is living, he knows the story of the 3 daughters of this man. So he has a very personal and close connection to his flock. And then, of course, the defense of the faith. So he is presented in a way to the church as this next category of saints, of saintly bishops who may not be the theological giants like John Chrysostom or Basil the Great or Augustine, but their pastoring, their shepherding becomes the model that is to be emulated. And the other reality when it comes to Nicholas is just the sheer amount of miracles that are associated with him. So after he dies, and his funeral is attended by thousands and thousands of people, he is buried in the cathedral of the city of Myra, and his tomb becomes a place of pilgrimage. It begins first for the locals. So the locals come there because they know him. This is the good bishop. This is the one who did all this. This is the one who knew our families. This is the one who performed these miracles. So he was very beloved. And people who came to pray at his tomb, miracles happened. Their prayers were answered. And this begins to spread. So much so that Myra becomes one of the stops for Christians traveling by sea to the Holy Land. So they would go to, as they travel, they would stop, to refresh, but it was also a destination. And so many Christians who went to the Holy Land or were coming from the Holy Land actually went and stopped there to visit his tomb and to pray. At this time, his body was known to have been complete for a while, according to his autobiography or his biography by Michael the Archimandrite. However, eventually, when there were only bones left, the bones were known to exude a substance that was oily and aromatic, and it was called, this substance is called myrrh, and that is the Greek word that is used for it. With this substance would then be mixed with olive oil and would be distributed to the faithful, to the pilgrims who came, and used for their anointing and for and many miracles would happen. And eventually, all these miracles were being compiled and held by the monastery that was located right next to the cathedral. They were the ones who were responsible for the telling of his story. However, with the publication of his biography, his name becomes even better known. And so at the time of the early 9th century, the first church dedicated to Saint Nicholas is opened in the city of Rome. And his story is being copied and shared. Why? Well, while the miracles are very interesting, and however, he himself doesn't have any great theological works. His biography is just that. It's a simple biography. Why is it so important to share the life of this good bishop? Well, beginning in the 8th century and even a little earlier, bishops started becoming very politically active. And bishops, many of them became involved in court intrigue. They became involved in Constantinople. They became involved in the iconoclasm. There were many things that bishops were doing that were things that Nicholas does not do. And so I think there's no doubt that Nicholas was also being presented in the 9th century as a model of bishop we need to return to. So getting away from the political stuff, those who are just working on their careers, and finding this man who had a much more faith-filled and simple life that was exemplary and filled with the presence of God and many, many miracles. And so I think that was one of the main reasons. As Nicholas, though, becomes more popular, his fame also spreads, especially among the Greek-speaking populations that are around the Roman Empire. Half of, well, let's say just southern Italy, so a third of Italy was culturally Greek-speaking, And so no doubt the story of St. Nicholas made it also in the 8th century to, in 9th century with the biography, made it to southern Italy. And so we come then finally to this period of conflict with the Turks. The Byzantine Empire begins to be attacked by different Turkish tribes. And in the year 1071, the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV faced the Sultan Arslan, who was the head of the Seljuk Turks. So it's a Turkish tribe. And the Battle of Manzikert took place, where Romanos was defeated. And so he lost control over a significant portion of Asia Minor, and that also included the town of Myra. Myra was already a bigger city at this point because of St. Nicholas, because of the tourism, because of all of the different pilgrims coming, and of course it was a port. And so as life became, more people came to the city in search of work and livelihood, so the city becomes more important. In the confusion following the conquest of the Seljuk Turks, a group of Italian sailors come from Bari, and in the year 1087, they take the relics of St. Nicholas. And now this is, depending on who's telling the story, it's either a theft or it's a translation of the relics. The interesting thing, though, is that the theft, it's probably not a theft, because the monks, there were monks who took care of the tomb of St. Nicholas, and they could not come in there, break in there, and just steal the relics. The reality is that probably the monks realized that the Seljuk Turks were here to stay, and this is already 16 years into the occupation by the Seljuk Turks. And so as they go and they're converting churches into mosques and forcing people to convert to Islam, and these things are happening, so the realization is that the pilgrimages to the tomb of St. Nicholas will end, and possibly even his tomb will be desecrated and maybe the church turned into a mosque. And so this perhaps was a collaborated effort to get the relics out of Myra. One of the issues, of course, as there always is with this kind of history, is that if you remember back to the schism, so in the year 1054, East and West splits up, and there is a mutual excommunication. And so the Church of Constantinople, which is over Myra, even though Myra is under the Seljuk Turks, is not in communion with the bishop of this group of Italian sailors from the city of Bari. And so according to the Greek telling, so the version as told by Constantinople, it was a theft because there wasn't communion. However, all the other churches, including Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, the Church of Kievan Rus, which would become later the Ukrainian and Russian churches. All of these churches have the feast of the translation of the relics of St. Nicholas on their calendar. Because all of these churches, even though today they're not in communion with Rome, at that time they were still in full communion with Rome. And so they saw the move of his relics as being a liberation for his relics. And so they then came, brought the relics to the city of Bari. And from Bari, the relics were divided up. And so they did go to different places. And they reached, for example, one of the oldest shrines dedicated to St. Nicholas and his relics and his veneration is located in the city of Worms in Germany. And it is considered that from this city, which received the relics, I believe, in only about 40 years after they got to Bari, it is probably historically plausible to say that from that site, his fame grew. And so he became popular because St. Nicholas, in order for him to be this enormous towering figure that Martin Luther decides to take down, that he had to be a very big presence in German Christianity and Northern European Christianity in general. And so Worms is probably the place where that happened. The Cathedral of Worms had just been built in the thousands. And let me share with you, it is a Romanesque cathedral. And as we're looking by the tree, if you look at the tree that's right in the middle, to the left, there are flag posts. And then further left, you'll see a building. And that is the St. Nicholas Chapel. And so that was built in the early 12th century. And then over the entranceway to the chapel is one of the oldest Romanesque images of St. Nicholas. Right there. And he is depicted as a Western bishop. He is also beardless. And we see a couple of details around him. So there are the three girls and their father to the right. And then there is a boat with people, and flying over that boat is a demon. And so one of the miracles that is associated with pilgrimage to Myra was told that a group of faithful who were going to his tomb were setting out by sea, and the devil disguised himself as an old woman. And he convinced, he said that he could not go with them, but he wanted to send oil as a gift, as a votive offering to the saint's shrine. And so he gave some of the pilgrims a bottle of oil so that they would take it with them and then light it, pour it into the lamps that hang in the shrine of St. Nicholas. And during the trip, an angel appeared, St. Nicholas appeared to the captain of the ship, and he told him that there was this container of oil and that he should take that from the people and throw it into the sea, which he did, and the oil ignited and caused a raging fire on the sea. So it was some sort of explosive oil. But it's associated, it's interesting, that was one of the last miracles associated with pilgrimage to St. Nicholas. And so the fact that, it appears all the way up in Germany in this town of Worms is kind of fascinating. You can see how his fame spreads. This here, I wanted to share also with you, just so we get a little bit of an idea of what his church looked like. This is what is today the Cathedral of Myra in Lycia. And it is not a mosque. It is an archaeological site. And you can see in the front would be where the altar is. And there's a baldacchino. The 4 columns that are still there are the baldacchino that would have been over the altar. Behind the altar is where the clergy would sit. So this church is from the time of St. Nicholas. So it may have even been erected under his leadership. And of course, there are embellishments, and it has been made bigger. And certain details probably came to be because of all of the pilgrimages to his tomb. Then this here, this is a close-up of that area. So you can see where the under the columns would have been the altar. So the 2 in the front, the 2 big columns, are part of the chancel screen, which is the icon screen. Then behind it are 4 columns that would have been in the baldacchino. And then you see the base of the altar without the actual altar stone over it. And then behind you see the synthronos, which is the seating for the clergy, kind of like amphitheater style. And then this here, this is what is presumably, well, this photo is not good. Unfortunately, I do not have another photo of the tomb. This one is a blurry photo. But the tomb, you can look it up. There is there is an attempt to locate what would have actually been the tomb. There are different theories. We're not sure because archaeologically speaking, we don't have all the information. We don't have signs that tell us. And in looking around for information online, I did have to chuckle when I found a number of news sources recording or reporting that as their headline, Tomb of Santa Claus found. I thought, well, that's going to be scarring for a lot of kids. But it's all in the title. Of course, it is about the tomb of Saint Nicholas. When he got to Bari, so they did him good. They built a beautiful basilica, and his relics are held within this altar. Underneath there is where you see all the lamps, and then that metal grill, that is where his relics are held. And behind the altar, you can see an icon of St. Nicholas that was a votive gift offered by the Serbian king in the 13th century. And, and so we're still talking a reasonable communion between East and West here at the tomb, at the new tomb of St. Nicholas. The icon, which is a real masterpiece of Serbian Byzantine art. Let's see, I think this one should be a better resolution. Shows the actual king and his wife at the bottom of the icon as the ones offering this icon to the shrine. So that is a beautiful piece, and that hangs right behind his tomb. And at his tomb, certain phenomena have continued. So, for example, the oil, that the substance, the oily substance that comes from his bones, has continued to exude at different rates, not always the same. His bones are held within a marble ossuary, and once a year on the feast of St. Nicholas, the manna, it's called manna, like manna that rained on the Israelites, is collected. And this manna is collected and then mixed with olive oil, and then that is put either on cotton swabs for people to take home, or even poured into little bottles. And this is one of those bottles. And it's marked Basilica di San Nicola Bari Santa Manna, the Holy Manna. And I still got a little bit. And so that is taken and sent around the world. You can actually write to the Basilica in Bari and they will send it to you. And so that is, part of their mission. And through this manna, miracles have continued. Now, the relics of St. Nicholas, the primary amount, I guess the most important relics are located in Bari. Then the Church of St. Nicholas in Venice has some 500 bone fragments. So they're not complete bones. They're little fragments, but for whatever reason, they were able to get a large amount of relics. Some also can be found in the Vatican. And then, interestingly enough, just about 15 years ago, a large piece of the pelvis of St. Nicholas was found in an Orthodox church in Morton Grove, Illinois. I know, I couldn't believe that one either. And I just found this out today, so I have to go look this guy up and see what he's doing in Morton Grove. There's been a project for about the last 30 years to connect these relics so that for ecumenical reasons, for historical reasons, to understand a little bit more about this saint who transcends East and West. And so that's how this relic was found in Illinois, because it had actually come to Illinois through a church in France that had it for a long time, and then I guess downsized on the relics, which happened. And so the relic ended up in the United States. The the one interesting thing, even though there is all of this going on as far as ecumenism and trying to bridge and even weave some of the history of St. Nicholas, one of the big stickling points is that the keepers of the relics, the primary relics of St. Nicholas, are not permitting any scientific research to be done on the relics, lest something come out. Remember how the Shroud of Turin went and all that got very messy very fast? So because of that, the Dominican fathers who are responsible for the relics of St. Nicholas, they're not all that interested in going the scientific route. And so they don't want any testing to be done on the bones. That being said and done, other relics, including relics held in Italy, and as well as in France and Germany, have been tested. And so, and those relics are all consistent with the timing. So it is, and especially what's interesting is that some of those relics are directly related to Bari. So we know the date when those relics were taken from Bari and put in churches in Germany, France, and other parts of Italy. So that's one important step. The other thing, what did happen was in about 25 years ago, the relics of, no, it was actually in 15 years ago, the relics of St. Nicholas and Bari were removed from the altar, and they were rearranged and cleaned and documented. As a part of the documenting of all of the relics, those who were hired, and this was done, it was in-house, so it was done within the church by accredited professionals. So they photographed each fragment, measured it, made drawings. I mean, they kept wonderful records of each of these pieces. So much so that 5 years ago, with technology going where it is, scientists who are part of the church, so not some renegade group, they were able to create a virtual skeleton of St. Nicholas using the pictures and the drawings and then piecing it together. And of course, once you had this, they were able to then print out the skull, print it out, with the 3D printer, and then use that with forensic science to recreate the likeness of St. Nicholas. And so this is what was produced. A Mediterranean man who looks quite reasonably close to the icons that we see of him. And then this is also the side view. And they were able, for example, one of the things they were able to see that he also had probably had his nose broken at some point. And so there was an indicator of a fracture from that in his skull. But we get a pretty good idea of what he looked like. And so he looked very similar then to the images that we are familiar with of St. Nicholas. Now, this here, just talking about the continuation of his many miracles, this icon, which is made in mosaic, it is on Mount Athos in the monastery of Stavronikita. And it was discovered in the 12th century by fishermen who pulled it up. Their nets got stuck in this panel, and they pulled this up right off of the shore of Mount Athos. And they pulled up the icon, and he had embedded that crack that you see in the middle of his forehead, had an oyster embedded there. And so when they brought the image to the shore, one of the fishermen immediately removed the oyster, and blood came from the gash there in the forehead of Saint Nicholas. The icon was immediately taken up to the monastery, which was at that time just being built. It was a small monastery, and it's been there for the last 900 years or so, performing many miracles through the intercession of Saint Nicholas. It is one of the most important miraculous images of Saint Nicholas that we know. So that's a very interesting image in and of itself. Since we're beginning to get a little close on time, I want to bring up one more important miracle, and a miracle that affects us. There was in 1907, on December 19th, which December 19th is the feast of Saint Nicholas according to the old calendar, the Julian calendar. And so in the town, the village of Jacobs Creek in Pennsylvania, a town that had a large mine, and basically all the people who lived there were somehow associated with the mine. On that day, all of the Byzantine people of the town asked for a day off, and because it was the feast of Saint Nicholas, to go to church. And so they were not at the mine when there was a large explosion in the mine. And so it is through the intercession of Saint Nicholas that is recorded in our Byzantine churches and also in the Orthodox churches. And we see, this is a photograph of the headline. Over 300 died on that day at Dar Mine. And it is also commemorated. This is actually, here is the here's the sign. Oh, it's 239, and they were mainly from Hungary, but that would have been Austro-Hungary, so Central Europe, countries that are today Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Ukraine, Hungary, Austria, Slovenia, and even Romania. That would have been from a larger region. However, the Hungarians were Protestant and Roman Catholic, so unfortunately they were in the mine when it exploded, and it ended up being only those who were Byzantine and Orthodox who were not in the mine and were spared. And that's over 200 men and boys who would have been in the mine who were not there. And some of the parishes that are close to Jacobs Creek, and we have a couple of churches there, as well as Orthodox churches, So they have commemorated the event in, oh, it's not in this icon, but this one is a life icon. So you see different events from the life of St. Nicholas. But it is commemorated in, okay, I don't have that picture. Oh, here it is. So this is not a great resolution picture, but you can see the, on the right-hand side are the people who are outside of the church. And then on the left-hand side, you see the image of the miners who perished in the mine and the canaries in the cage. So this icon was actually painted for the 100th anniversary of that disaster, which happened on December 19th, 1907. And it went to one of the churches that is associated with that event that had parishioners who worked in the mine. And so that's one of the kind of recent history miracles associated with St. Nicholas. And there are many. If you go to Bari to visit his tomb, you will see an endless line of people who are coming to visit him. The Basilica also recently, in the last few years, authorized significant portions of his bones to travel to different parts of the world. And one of the first countries that requested relics to come tour, so they weren't being given, they returned to Bari, but to come tour was Russia. And in Russia, the amount of the way that he was received was, just they estimated in Moscow over the few days that the relic was there, that over 100,000 people came to venerate his relics. And this was the container, the reliquary that was made for his bone. And it was, I think, only one big bone that was sent in the reliquary. Here's a picture of its placement inside. And so that was the reliquary. It was done. And this, I think, is also I think it might be from either pelvis or femur. But they've identified all of the bones and where they come from. So, and St. Nicholas is depicted in many different ways. So this, for example, this is from Germany also, from the 13th century, depicting, again, St. Nicholas without a beard. And he is depicted there raising the 3 children from the barrel, the pickling barrel. So the stories of Nicholas have been, turned into artistic masterpieces and can be found really all over Europe. It is an incredible legacy that he has left for us. But I still am partial to this stuff. There it is. It was on a wall, a fresco showing Nicholas and how he dealt with heretics. The good stuff. Okay, thank you for your attention. Any questions? Well, I think that is the ultimate of Christian values is finding the balance. It's not just about picking, one subject, one topic, one cause. The entire, all the saints are reflections of that balance of witness to faith, and how it is lived and how it is shared. So I don't think, yes, there is a focus perhaps on certain aspects. And I think, yes, we've come to a place as a civilization where buffet Christianity is definitely on the menu. People go and pick what parts of the faith they want to adhere to, and then leave behind other things that are somehow uncomfortable or that they can't relate to. And I think that this is what we see in the church, in the early church, but it is reflected through the saints of the church, and it is consistent, is this importance of balancing out our living of the faith. So what we believe and what we live and what we do, what we teach, all of that is integrated. That is definitely what St. Nicholas did. Very much so. Well, that's where the association with where his parents' wealth came from. So that's theoretical. I think his appearance to different travelers, including merchants, his appearance, his being brought to Italy, that had a large merchant class, between Venice as well as other ports in Italy. Merchants were very common. And the association that travel by sea, which was the primary way of travel for the merchants, so it kind of all interconnected. St. Nicholas was also, and you could say still is, one of the patron saints of travel. Sailors too, yes. He's patron saint of many different causes, yes. Yeah, I think it was one of those things that did find a healthy reform. It is in Europe, in Central Europe especially, that is who brings Christmas gifts. And it's always on the 24th, and it is specifically the child Jesus. So it's always as it is worded, and that would be in Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, parts of Austria, and then it continues over into parts of France. So it's something that is also known today in the Catholic world. Yeah, when I was growing up, so that's all we knew. We knew that it was the child Jesus. I remember when I was, I think maybe 5 or 6 years old, and my parents took me to a bank, and in the bank they had Santa Claus sitting there, and I didn't know who it was. I had no idea because that wasn't part of my cultural references. And I remember thinking because everybody was kind of like venerating him. So I kept on thinking maybe that's God the Father. I did have the Michelangelo thing in the house, so like, yeah, not quite. Yeah, well, and that's in many countries, Italy has the tradition also associated with the three kings. And so it ends up being on the 6th of January. And the 25th or the 24th is more of a church holiday, not so much about giving gifts, but all of that is changing very fast, and thanks to globalization, Santa Claus is everywhere, and so things are fluid, and Christmas is changing in some of these countries too. So it's, I think one of the interesting things, and we'll be talking about this in a couple of weeks. We've got two webinars about Christmas. And one of the interesting things is that in the early church, Christmas, and so the Nativity and the baptism of Christ was celebrated within a 24-hour period. And that was the 5th of January in the evening was for the Nativity, and the 6th was for the baptism of Christ. And so, all of that has changed. And it's probably for the best. It's one of those things where in the experience of Christianity lived and celebrated, the fasting and the feasting, all of this creates and adds to the excitement of celebrating the feasts. So next Wednesday, we will be looking at the prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah is very important because he is the one who is considered the prophet of the coming of the Messiah. And then he also gave us the words of Handel's Messiah. So Handel didn't give that to us. He just copied Isaiah. And then the 2 following weeks, we'll be talking about the beginnings of the Nativity, both biblically as well as the celebration, the observance of the feast. And then on the 23rd of December, we'll be looking at the iconography. The iconography, and I don't mean just icons, I mean looking at all of that in the early church, because this was the feast that was easiest to be expressed. Other things were difficult, from the crucifixion, expressing miracles was difficult, focusing on Jesus as a child, divine and human. How do you express that? But the birth of a child was easy. And so we find in the catacombs already, we find images of the Nativity of Christ. And so it's fascinating to see the development, that takes us a little bit away from the nativity scenes that we may be used to. Because, of course, the most important thing when you look at the image of the nativity is, what is the church teaching? That's the number one question. It's not about the emotional impact or seeing something that is moving. That's not enough. The church wants us to move up here. And when we move up here, then we move in our hearts too. So that's the setup for the next 3 weeks, kind of sticking to Christmas and going with the season. So thank you very much for joining me. I am in my dining room / kitchen. My Christmas cactus is right behind me with lights. Yeah, well, my mom says it doesn't count as a tree, so it says I still have to put up a tree. Thanks, Mom. A good evening. Happy St. Nicholas. Celebrate his feast. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.